Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson. And welcome back to me, I guess, and of course to you tuning in here. It's been a couple of weeks, actually about 3. Back on the 9th, I had a little bit of a technical difficulty trying to get the lesson to work, I think. So I wasn't able to actually get that posted in time. And the last 2 weekends, I've been in Ecuador. So glad to be home, and thankfully, by the Lord's grace, not only has all of our team made it back, but with that, so has the rest of my family, as I had one of my daughters and my son down there with me. And so it was a true joy to serve amongst the Lord's people there and to be busy about his mission. But that being said, here we are in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, and we're going to be studying some parables that Jesus is telling here and how they relate to the specific subject of the kingdom. So as you can see, the title, I've given this lesson on the screen, The Secret of Middle Matthew. I'll just warn you up front, we're going to go on a little bit of a roller coaster ride, visiting several different parts of Matthew chapter 13 especially, but even outside of Matthew 13, other parts of Matthew's gospel, and specifically Psalm 78, but that will make sense as we go through this. And so what I want to do is just go ahead and read these 2 particular passages that are highlighted from our Gospel Project lesson. And after that, we'll start to focus a little bit on the context of Matthew 13 and just build on this as we explore it together. So if you'll join me in verse 31, Jesus presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky can come and nest in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and mixed into 50 pounds of flour until all of it was leavened. Skipping down to verses 44 through 50, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure buried in a field that a man found and reburied. Then in his joy, he goes and sells everything he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a large net thrown into the sea. It collected every kind of fish. And when it was full, they dragged it ashore, sat down, and gathered the good fish into containers, but threw out the worthless ones. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will go out, separate the evil from the righteous, and throw them into the blazing furnace. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. If you'll join me now for a moment of prayer. Jesus, our King, Lord, we love you. We thank you so much because you are good, and there is no defining good apart from you. You are faithful. You are merciful. You are kind. We are unworthy to be your subjects. We are unworthy to be called your disciples. We're unworthy to be your friend. Lord, the love that you bear for us is truly matchless, incomparable to anything that we know or have experienced. From the bottom of our hearts, Lord, we give you praise, and you are worthy of all praise, all honor, to receive all strength, power, and glory. It is our privilege as your people to give you that now and throughout eternity. Lord, as we're gathered here in this time, in this place, please open our minds. Lord, I pray if you have shared something with me this week, and I believe that you have, as I've studied and prepared for this, I pray that you'll help me to be faithful in communicating that to those who are listening. I pray you'll guide my words. I pray you'll help me to hear you as I trust you are speaking to me, and you will help me to relay that information here. Lord, it's difficult at times knowing that I don't have the ability to interact with those who are listening, and so I can't gauge or tell whether or not they're receiving what is being said. So I just pray, in spite of my ineptitude and my stumblings, Lord, that you would please let your word resonate within their hearts. And in every person who hears this, may the thing that you have prepared for them be what they receive. May it transform all of our hearts to be more faithful disciples, following you and understanding your word more completely. And by virtue of that, its author, you, your heart, and how to please you by faith. We ask this in your name. Amen. So if you think about it, it might seem a little strange that Jesus is expounding upon something so vast and almost incomprehensible as the kingdom of heaven with such short little parables that in some instances are truly no more than 1 or 2 sentences long. And all of these, of course, are all strung along like, no pun intended, but a string of pearls, one right after the other in sequence. And without even giving the hearers time to contemplate or think about what Jesus is saying, he moves right on to the next parable that is framing up the exact same thing that he just referenced in the previous parable, but in a whole new way. And instead of really trying to expound upon the depth or the what am I trying to say? The depth of the kingdom, that's why I'll just leave it at that word. Jesus is speaking somewhat of the nature and maybe character of the kingdom, and not just these parables, but other parables that do speak to the kingdom itself. But in these particular parables, he's more or less talking about its presence within human history. And so in order for us to look at these parables and appreciate how they're being utilized in this gospel, we have to be familiar with the context that precedes it to know why Matthew is placing the parables where he is in the sequencing of his gospel. It's not really a good practice for us to just take those sayings of Jesus, as goes the kingdom, and extrapolate them from that context, and then from that attempt to try to build a doctrine of the kingdom apart from the host text. Sometimes that becomes the actual faulty point of what we would refer to as systematic theology, because many times, apart from biblical theology, which attempts to try to look at those passages in their host context, systematic theology wants to distill certain disciplines or teaching within the Bible into doctrines, which is not bad. And please don't take what I'm saying as a way of bashing systematic theology. Just as any sort of or form of theology has, it will have its strong points, and it has very good strong points, but it may have a few weak points along the way as well. And it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge those for what they are, and then see if other forms of theology and the study of Scripture can help us support or bolster the weak points of other systems of theology for a more comprehensive understanding of Scripture. All that being said, if we isolate these passages out of their context and just attempt to try to look at what Jesus says in between the quotation marks provided in the gospel, there might be some key details that we're missing if we don't take special care to appreciate where Matthew has taken us so far and where he is taking us after this, because there is a very particular structure in place within Matthew's gospel that he has purposefully embedded these parables within. And if we're not careful to appreciate that structure, there are going to be details that we'll miss, attempting to try to connect Matthew's sayings with those of other parts of Scripture and marrying up passages that I won't say are not intended to be married up with each other, but will make connections between those passages in an artificial sense that were not meant to be there from the original authors of Scripture. Okay. It may not make a lot of sense in what I'm saying now, but I hope it will as we work through this. Okay. So looking a little earlier in Matthew chapter 13, we have Jesus's disciples coming up to him, and Jesus has just told the parable of the sower, and we're all very familiar with that, with respect to the one who goes out flinging the seed on all manner of types of soil, and with that, 4 different soils will seemingly produce 4 different results, and only one of those particular soils happens to be fruitful and fertile. The disciples, I would imagine, are highly enthusiastic about their teacher, who they understand and have embraced to be Messiah, and are eager for Israel at large to come to understand that Jesus is Messiah as well. That once they hear him teach, they will also understand that he's Messiah and want to follow him. And before you know it, the gathering that has started out with just a paltry dozen is going to amass into thousands, and of course is going to eventually challenge the might of Rome. But when Jesus starts to talk to them in parables, no doubt the disciples looking around at the crowds can see, as sometimes I do when I look at the faces of those whom I'm teaching or perhaps preaching to, that there might be a little bit perplexed at what I'm saying. And whereas I need to make sure that I'm correcting what it is that I'm saying in such a way, or I should say, maybe explaining what it is I'm saying in such a way that now I've maybe corrected a mistake I've made, or maybe I've led them down a path that seems to be confusing, and I need to correct course so that I don't confuse them further. Whereas with Jesus as the master teacher that he was, I imagine he had no doubt about what it was he was saying, and certainly had no desire to correct what it was he was saying. He meant to give them hard things, hard truths to wrestle with. And this perplexes even the disciples, who then come to him and say, "Why are you speaking to them in parables?" And he answered, "The secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given for you to know." And of course, the disciples will make it clear to Jesus, and not that Jesus needed them to make it clear to him. He knows that they struggle too with these things. And that's the reason why he challenges them all the more when he says, "These things have not been given to them to know." He said, "For whoever has, more will be given to him," meaning, I have given you the understanding of these things. And he will, after he explains to them this parable, and in time, he intends to expound the meaning for all of these parables. Maybe not necessarily in intimate one-on-one discussions with the disciples apart from the larger group of followers that are there to hear his sermons, but perhaps through the illumination that the Holy Spirit will bring to them even after Jesus has left them and returned to heaven, and they begin their mission in spreading the gospel. Either way, at some point, they will receive understanding of these things, because Jesus said it's for them. And not only will they receive understanding in this, but they will receive even more with respect to what the kingdom of heaven is about. And he says, "And whoever will have more than enough," and he will have more than enough, "but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And this is why I speak to them in parables," because they think they have, but they don't. And what little they do have, meaning they think themselves guaranteed a place within the kingdom, and this too will be taken away from them. "And this is why I speak to them in parables, because looking they do not see, hearing they do not listen or understand. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, you will listen and listen, but you will never understand. You will look and look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous. Their ears are hard of hearing. They have shut their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn back, and I would heal them." Now, we understand this going back to Isaiah's particular moment, or I should say the Isaiah scroll, and the particular moment of Isaiah's calling, when Isaiah is entranced in a vision where he sees himself in the temple of the Lord. The Holy of Holies is open to him, and he sees heaven and earth joined together, as the one who sits on the throne of heaven also has his feet and the train of his robe touching the earth, the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. And Isaiah sees him and realizes, of course, that he is a man of unclean lips who lives among a people of unclean lips. He is undone. He is trepidatious about the fact that he deserves death. He knows it, but instead, this seraph comes from attending the Lord's throne to take a coal from the altar and atone for his sin, touching it to his lips. And then the call goes, "Who will I send? Who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Here I am, send me." And so the Lord says, "Go." And he tells him what to say to these people: to keep listening, but do not understand, to keep looking, but do not perceive, and to make the minds of these people dull, deafen their ears, blind their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their minds, turn back and be healed. And of course, one asks, why would that be? Why wouldn't the Lord want his people to see, to hear, and then to turn back? The problem is that the Lord does want this, but he has been doing this now for centuries through many notable prophets, and they have continued to stubbornly rebel, even in the days of Moses. And Moses, before he leaves them, calls them out on that, saying, "You have done nothing but rebel against the Lord since we left Egypt." From one generation that has come and went, whose bones litter the landscape of this desert, to another who has risen in their place, but still struggle with things that they shouldn't, having seen and heard with their own eyes and their own ears what the Lord has done. Because there is an ample crowd here who have good memory of what the Lord was doing in Egypt and what the Lord has done since then at Sinai, and from Sinai all throughout the desert. But in spite of that, you continue to struggle. You will give yourself unto a point to the Lord, but you will not give your whole hearts. And you've been struggling in this way while I've been alive among you, challenging you, how much more after I leave your presence in death. And so this has been the legacy of the people. And now Isaiah's journey is one such that He will continue to commend the people to be faithful to the covenant. But of course, this message, while it makes the Lord in every way faithful to continue to remind these people of what their arrangement with him was, at the same time, it frees him up to be able to also exercise the right of the covenant on his part as a party who entered into that covenant, if it's broken, to exact the vengeance and, of course, the curses of the covenant, which through Isaiah he is announcing will happen. But both the commendation to return to the covenant and the truth of what God intends to do in the immediate future of these people Isaiah is talking to through the hand of the Assyrians, and then sometime later through the hand of the Babylonians, and that is to bring judgment upon them. Both of these messages fall on deaf ears, and Isaiah finds himself preaching to a people who are seemingly blind, deaf, who have the physical ability to see and to hear, but yet spiritually speaking, they are without sense and cannot perceive what the Lord is doing. And Isaiah even says, until when? And God gives him clearly when the terminus of this will be: cities lying in ruins, houses are without people, the land is ruined and desolate, and the Lord drives the people far away, leaving great emptiness in the land. Though a tenth will remain in the land, it will be burned again, like the terebinth or the oak that leaves a stump when felled, and the holy seed is that stump, meaning the kingdom, if it's treated like a tree, is going to be completely chopped down till there's nothing left but the stump, but a faithful remnant will grow out of that stump. Now, the thing is, if Jesus is invoking the words of the Isaiah prophecy, which was fulfilled in the time of Isaiah, then we see yet again another fulfillment of it in the days of Jesus, because this repetitive pattern is going on yet again. Those people in Isaiah's day are enamored with worshiping idols and refuse to give their whole hearts to the Lord in obedience. And while idol worship in the sense of bowing down to an image that is a separate entity and represents an altogether different being than the person who is bowing and bringing offerings and gifts to that particular image, it's been traded for another form of idolatry in the sense of worshiping self and the ideology of what they believe the kingdom is supposed to be and how God is going to fulfill these prophecies and what these people must do in order to satisfy God. And yet when God himself stands among them, incarnated in human flesh, and tells them that their understanding of these things is wrong, but has come to graciously give them the first chance at entering into this kingdom, they will not listen. They will not appreciate with their own eyes the truth of what they see in the miracles and working of Jesus. And with that, they will reject God all the same as those of Isaiah's day and generation will reject God with blinded eyes and deafened ears. And so by virtue of that, while Jesus is invoking this, he is saying that just as Isaiah did back in his day, Israel is on a one-way collision course with a day, a rendezvous moment when God is going to bring judgment upon them. And yet again, the cities will lie in ruins, the houses will be without people, the land without inhabitants, and it will also lie in desolation and ruin. And of course, with Isaiah's day, that happened to be for the northern kingdom of Israel at the hand of Assyria. More than a century later, at the hands of the Babylonians, the kingdom of Judah was annihilated. And then in Jesus's day, it's going to be the empire that had replaced all of those that had come before it. The Romans will come and destroy Jerusalem and the province of Judea once again. So we understand then that there's something there with respect to that, but this all precedes these parables that we read at the beginning of our lesson. It comes after the first parable that begins to speak to the concept of kingdom. But now after this, as Jesus has said why he speaks in parables, he then goes on to present yet another parable, which is not quite yet where we begun in our text, but it's a very pivotal and an important parable for us to appreciate what's coming up later in the ones that we read at the beginning of this lesson. So continue to listen here. He presented another parable to them, and he said, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed seeds amongst the wheat, and left. And when the plant sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. And the landowner's servants came to him and said, Master, didn't you sow seed in your field? Then where did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he told them. So do you want us to go and pull them up? The servants asked, No, he said. When you pull up the weeds, you might also pull up the wheat with them. So let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers to gather the weeds first tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn. Now, here's the thing. Many of us, when we hear this parable, throughout our years of being exposed to preaching and teaching, reading and commentaries and whatnot, I would imagine the vast, more predominant way of interpreting this particular parable has been thinking of it from our perspective in history as yet still future to us. That there is one great moment of harvest that lies at the end of this age in which God is going to separate out the wheat from the chaff, the sheep from the goats. Use any analogy that you might want, whether from scripture or one that you might concoct to make it more relatable to our own day and time. Either way, that once this separation happens, it's off to one of two final destinations. It's going to be into life everlasting or to damnation everlasting. And it seems most plausible that that would be the case. However, I think it's important for us to realize that we have to consider this parable in conjunction with other parables and other teaching that has already come to us from within this gospel itself. Because remember, this particular portion of Matthew's gospel can in no way, shape, or form be considered separate from any other portion of Matthew's gospel. It is one cohesive unit. There are not portions of teaching in Matthew's gospel that are meant to be seen within a vacuum as if they only pertain to the time in which Jesus spoke those things and they fail to remain timeless beyond that, or particular aspects of teaching embedded in Matthew's gospel that would have had no bearing or significance to the original hearers, but they were messages that were left there, first spoken to Jesus's disciples, to then continue to share them with the community of Jesus's followers in the generation that would succeed them, and on through the periods of church history until our own time, until such a day in which the generation that would see these things come to pass, I'm really thinking more about Matthew 24 and 25, that would see these things come to pass, would then appreciate the things that Jesus said. No, Matthew wrote this gospel for those people in the first century that would be those who would pick up his gospel and read it to be able to understand it, and by virtue of that, find everything in that gospel in any shape, or I should say in every shape and form, completely applicable to them, as much as we would find that information completely applicable to us. Now, having said that, before I read what's on the right side of the screen in Matthew 21, we need to go back to the beginning of this gospel in Matthew 3, where Jesus is about to be baptized. And there we have John the Baptist coming. And in that particular moment, John has been preaching for at least months, maybe even a few years. And his message seems to center around the idea that he is the one who is the representative talked about in Isaiah 40, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, who is coming to preach comfort to God's people, knowing that God is going to visit them and he is going to restore them. However, before this time comes, they need to be prepared in heart and mind to meet the Lord. And so John couples this message with a baptism of repentance. And he tells them very clearly, using unmistakable terminology and with that unquestionable analogies, speaking with botanical language in mind, the idea that a great harvest is about to happen and that God is going to be bringing the root even to the axe. I've reversed those. Bringing the axe even to the root of the tree to chop the tree down, going right back to the very imagery that Isaiah has been invoking for us and others as well in their particular prophecies or oracles, men such as Ezekiel and so forth, who in speaking to God cutting the tree down is using that imagery as a way of saying judgment is coming. As the kingdom is going to arrive, God's people are going to be judged as much as the nations are. And the righteous are going to be those who are invited into the kingdom, while those who are unrighteous and have embellished in wickedness and so forth are, I should say, imbibed in wickedness, are going to be those who are judged for their crimes against God and are going to be sentenced to everlasting damnation. And then he uses the imagery, too, of the wheat being separated from the chaff and the wheat being gathered into the Lord's barns, while the chaff is going to be thrown up into the air and blown away. Or in this particular case, he speaks about an even more damnable curse or end for them, that the chaff is going to be even gathered and placed into the fire to be burned. Okay, so the question then becomes, if this is John's way of talking about what the arrival of the kingdom is going to look like, that he is indeed the one who is preceding the one who will come after him. If the messenger of Isaiah 40 is to prepare the way of the Lord, to make every valley to make every valley raised and to make every mountain low, to straighten every crooked path, because the one who will come behind him is the Lord. And we understand, even he recognizes that is Jesus once Jesus is baptized by him in the Jordan. John expects this to be the very way that Jesus will manifest the kingdom. Of course, I got to looking at the word Matthew on the screen and my mind just decided to go off for a second. I'm having a problem with that with respect to my words. I appreciate your patience as I continue to say, I should have said, or perhaps I should say, and substitute something else in place of that. It happens sometimes when I'm a little distracted. Again, I apologize. Nonetheless, digressing back to the lesson, John has his moments where he doubts. And while he's in prison, wondering perhaps why he's suffering as he is, and why Jesus is preaching the messages that he is, and why Jesus is so benevolently healing others and even showing mercy to Gentiles, that John sends what's left of his disciples to inquire of Jesus, wanting to know if Jesus is indeed the Messiah, or do they wait for another? Jesus confirms his identity using allusions to Isaiah 35 about those who he has touched and healed, that the lame leap like deer, that the blind see, the dead are even raised back to life. But with that, Jesus is not discouraging the message that John has preached. Jesus is nowhere in the Gospels even heard or cited as correcting the message that John preaches. In fact, he commends John in the statements that he makes as he turns back to the crowd of people that was around him that he was speaking to before he was interrupted by John's disciples. With that in mind, he speaks to the fact that John was born the greatest amongst all men, but yet even he is the least within the kingdom of heaven. All that to simply say, John was not mistaken in his understanding or his preaching. If anything, with the months and year or more of all the sermons that John preached, one would wonder why in the world are the gospel writers encouraged by the Spirit to include these words of John's message about the nature and the arrival of the kingdom of heaven, if these were uttered mistakenly, if John was more or less just parroting the eschatology that had taken shape and evolved over the last 5 centuries since these people had come back from Babylon and repopulated the land of their ancestors in Jerusalem and in the province of Judea, the former kingdom of Judah. That if they had come to understand that when Messiah comes, he is going to be bringing fiery wrath and condemnation for the Gentile nations and so forth, and that this was what John was thinking was going to happen. And so naturally, this is how he's going to preach to his people of the arrival of the kingdom and what this means consequently for both Jews and Gentiles, that if Jesus felt this was an error, that he would have corrected that. But instead, the gospel writers, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all faithful to record John's words as being a true message of what the arrival of the kingdom was going to be like. And yet we do not see that in the immediacy of the beginning of Jesus's ministry. So if that's not there, what are we to make of that? Well, when we go to a place like Matthew 24 and 25, coming on the heels of the end of Matthew 23 and the promise of judgment falling upon that generation that Jesus was speaking these words to, and as those words are echoed through Mark 13 and Luke 21, we understand very clearly that the judgment that John was speaking about the cutting down of the tree, what they had expected of the growing of their kingdom from the time of the return from the exile in Babylon to the time when Messiah comes to bring the kingdom into its full fruition. At least that's what they were hoping for, that it's going to be seen as a time of judgment, especially for those who are considered wicked in God's eyes. So that being said, we understand that the judgment brought at the hands of the Romans on the people of Jerusalem and in the province of Judea at the time of the Romans laying siege to it from AD 66 to 70 is a clear culmination of what John had been preaching and what Jesus is echoing again in places like Matthew 24. I'm going to get into that here a little bit more later on, but all that to just simply point out that John's words and the use of his language with respect to speaking about Israel and the harvest of these people and the gathering of the wheat into the barn and the burning of the chaff is something that Jesus is also going to echo in Matthew chapter 9, when he encourages his disciples to lift their eyes, to look upon the fields, and to appreciate the fact that Israel is white, ready for the harvest now. Okay, so with that in mind, Matthew 21, Jesus says this. He's speaking to the Pharisees. Listen to another parable. There's a landowner. He planted a vineyard. He put a fence around it. He dug a wine press in it, and he built a watchtower. All of these allusions back to Isaiah chapter 5 and the song of the vineyard that was beginning with very flowery language of the description of how God had planted a vineyard, but then turns sour, all the pun intended with that, very quickly when we speak of the very grapes that came from that harvest, which instead of being the sweet, succulent grapes that were supposed to produce the very good tasting wine, instead it was sour grapes. And because the entire crop was ruined, God turned this over to the judgment of what would come when he kicks down the barriers, the rock wall that he made to surround it to prevent it from being spoiled. And then he laid it open to all those who wanted to come and pillage it. So Jesus begins this particular parable in the same way, but instead he goes on to talk about how servants were sent to collect the due rent from those who were allowed to work this particular garden as tenant farmers. And with that, there were multiple iterations of servants who came, and we see how they were treated. They were harassed, maligned, even physically assaulted and abused. And with that, they return back to their owner, and the owner continues to send more servants, knowing full well they'll be subjected to the same torture, and it continues to seemingly get worse with every round of servants that he winds up sending, until finally he says, I understand that this is what they're going to continue to do. Surely they will not treat my son this way. And so he sends his son. And of course, what happens when the son comes? It says very clearly there, they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. Therefore, the owner of the vineyard comes. What do you think he's going to do? He says, these people agree, he will destroy those terrible men, and he will lease his vineyard to those farmers, to other farmers who will give him the fruit of the harvest. And Jesus says to them, have you never read in the scriptures, quoting the 118th Psalm, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is what the Lord has done, and isn't it marvelous in our eyes, or wonderful? Notice this, Jesus says, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to others producing its fruit. The point being in this particular parable is it alludes to the kingdom. As much as these parables in Matthew 13 allude to the kingdom, so does this one. But notice the uniqueness of this parable. In this parable, talking about the kingdom, Jesus is the parable. He is indeed the truth of it, but he comes at the end of the parable. The parable culminates with the son arriving on the scene, and he is supposed to be the one who will collect the ripe fruit from the vineyard, which is his due portion of it all. That belongs, of course, to the ultimate owner and master of the vineyard, which happens to be the father of the son. But instead, he is thrown out of the vineyard and he is killed. And of course, because of this, the kingdom is stripped away from those who thought it belonged to them, and instead given to those who they thought never would have a chance of entering into it, which happens to be these people all along the course of Matthew's gospel. Jesus has been inviting into the kingdom people of the ilk of Matthew, who is a tax collector, and many other tax collectors alongside him, such as Zacchaeus, who are repulsed and repudiated by their own people because of their crimes against God, number one, through what they were doing in their tax collecting business, and of course, the way that they had maligned themselves against their own people, siding with the Romans. Surely a tax collector would never be forgiven by God. In fact, a Pharisee would pride himself in praying unto God that he was not made like that tax collector. He felt himself more privileged and, of course, more blessed and certainly more righteous than a tax collector. Yet Jesus was saying even these infringed ones would be the ones who were entering the kingdom before the Pharisees, because they clearly did not understand. My point is this: Jesus is coming at the end of that parable. What it would seem to help us understand then is that perhaps other parables, maybe even all the parables that pertain to the kingdom, are not really meant to be seen as Jesus at the beginning of the parable, even though in some of these parables he seems to be positioned at the front of the parable. And then from that, the truth of the kingdom is that the kingdom is going to continue on throughout the rest of human history with its beginning at the time that Jesus arrives. Rather, perhaps the kingdom itself has actually already begun at a time prior to Jesus walking the earth. To sum it up a little bit more simply, perhaps if we go back to the time when the Babylonian exile began, and you compare the idea of the seed of Israel being contained inside the geographical boundaries of the land of Canaan that was promised to Abraham and his descendants, are now being taken by the Lord, and by virtue of his judgment are being flung to the nations far and wide. And you consider the idea that at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus is speaking about, through the nature of this parable of a farmer flinging seed, is somewhat representing the same thing. Now, you might stop me there and say, yes, but Jesus explains the parable of the sower, and he says that the seed is indeed the word of God. That's true. The word of God sown into the hearts of people. Yes. But the idea could be still yet a parallel truth alongside of that, because with these people, as they go to the nations, dispersed as they are, the idea is that with them, they are taking copies of God's word. In fact, in the intertestamental period and shortly after the beginning of the Christian era, with the close of the first century, we see a vast body of works that have grown through the 5 centuries that precedes the arrival of Jesus, and many bodies of Jewish writing that take place for much of the first century, if not almost the entire first century, and some even into the second. All of this considered part of Second Temple period literature. What that all stems from, of course, is the understanding that copies of sacred scripture were taken with them in the places that they went. In fact, the very system of copying that is ensure the accuracy and preservation of God's word from those ancient times, even up until now, in more modern times, when we've translated God's word, we have those copies to work from, thankfully, because of the efforts of groups like the Masoretes, who took great precaution at ensuring that God's word remained preserved amongst his people. But again, that happened after they were cast out of the land of Canaan, taken into exile at the hands of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The point would be is that perhaps they were sown as seeds then, which would make perfect sense when you consider the idea that when we go to Acts 2, what do we find? But many of these seeds seemingly turn or return back into Jerusalem at the time when Pentecost, and of course, there's no coincidence in this, that Pentecost happens to also incorporate the ideology of botanism, or sowing and growing, and with that harvesting, because Pentecost itself is known in the Old Testament as the Feast of Ingathering, called Pentecost because it occurs 50 days after Passover. So the idea of ingathering is that they're supposed to bring the first of their crops in. And so as they ate unleavened bread at the time of the Passover, now they are actually eating leavened bread, because they are baking mass amounts of bread for everyone who comes to celebrating this. And why? Because it's the first of the fruits of the harvest that have been gathered in, and they are bringing these as offerings unto God to thank him, and by virtue of that, they are all celebrating in the abundance of the harvest. It's a harvest moment here at Pentecost, when Jews, as you see from the list of nations that are brought here, from both within the Roman Empire and outside of the Roman Empire, as far away as Rome, or even the Parthians on the far eastern edge of the Roman Empire, are all coming in to celebrate this feast. And the one thing they never thought they were going to experience was a presentation by disciples who were claiming they were following a man known as Jesus, who came from Nazareth, who actually was the fulfillment of all their messianic hopes and wishes and dreams. And in these days that precedes their arrival in Jerusalem, he had just been put to death by the hands of their own people. But even though that happened, of course, the story did not end there. Jesus arises from the dead 3 days later, and by virtue of that has been exalted to the right hand of God, and now he rules cosmically over heaven and earth, and they are to give their loyalty and obedience to this person, though they've never heard of him and certainly have never seen him with their eyes. And the response by these people down in verse 37 of Acts chapter 2, not of everyone, but of a good portion of them. Perhaps there's more than 100,000, maybe a few 100,000. Some estimates may even go as high as 1 million Jews who were there, but at least 3,000 will respond when they hear these words being pierced in the heart, and they say, brothers, what should we do? So these seeds that have been flung amongst the nations and that have been growing and slowly ripening over the last 5 centuries are now, as Jesus said in Matthew 9, when he had been walking through the countryside of his own own homeland, and as he was preaching the news of the kingdom and watching the response of the people, trying to encourage his disciples to look with heavenly eyes and see the fields are ripe, but there are not enough workers to manage this harvest. So beseech the Lord of the harvest that he will raise up and send even more workers to handle this, because many will be beckoned and many are ready to come. And of course, that's exactly what happens here in Acts chapter 2, above and beyond what they would have anticipated. And of course, with that, many of these people are going to go back to their homelands, and they are going to begin to sow seeds amongst their own fellow Jews. That's exactly how the church in Rome begins. It wasn't through the working of either Peter or Paul going there and sharing the gospel with their own countrymen who had long since raised a synagogue in that city or any of these other cities. Rather, it's these Jews who had come to believe and trust in Jesus as Messiah and take those words back to their own countrymen, these Jews who were primed and ready to hear this truth. And of course, throughout the book of Acts, we see many run-ins that Paul will have with other people at various synagogues. And of course, the more pronounced response that is recorded by Luke for us is the way that these Jews castigate Paul and they chase him out of their town. But in many of these areas, we also find, that Luke is recording for us that there were both Jews and Gentiles, but especially Jews who were willing to listen to the words of Paul and were willing to follow, to believe this truth. And perhaps the greatest of the examples of those was when Paul and Silas went away to Berea, having just been chased out of Thessalonica. So when they wind up coming to them, they sit down and they share, and these people receive the word with eagerness, and they examined the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. And because of that, many of them believed, including a number of the prominent Greek women that were with them, until eventually they wind up getting chased out by those from Thessalonica who wind up chasing Paul down and agitating the crowds to incite rebellion against him as well, until he has to wind up leaving. The point being, again, just to sum this up, and make it rather clear, is to say that if this little box area happens to represent Israel, that at the time of the exile, the seed of Israel are being far flung all over the place, to the north, the south, the east, the west, whether they're voluntarily migrating out of the land because they understand that danger is imminent and they better get out now while they have the chance, or they're going to be forcefully removed if their people wind up succumbing in defeat to these militaristic powers, these empires that are going to come and challenge their tiny little kingdoms. And so with that, many of these communities will wind up remaining there. Even when they have the chance to wind up coming home, when Cyrus gives them the release, they stay. There's a vast community of Jews, even in Babylon, at the time that Jesus happened to be walking the earth, because they had built a life for themselves, and generations of Jews will continue to remain there because life is good for them. But it creates an area and a place where the gospel is already primed to take root and grow. All it needs is a messenger, a sower to come and spread it amongst them. So how does this relate to the kingdom? That the kingdom had been silently growing all this time. It doesn't seem to be that impressive because the kingdom is not consolidated in one geographic area, which is what they assumed was going to happen. Rather, the kingdom, as Jesus tells them as Matthew's gospel closes, he has all authority in heaven and on earth, and they are to go and make disciples. So we carry that message over to the beginning of Acts, where Jesus tells them, as they're wondering when he will restore the kingdom, and he refocuses their attention on not being concerned about things that they are not to worry with. God is working that out, and it will come as he said it would, as Jesus had already told them it would happen. And that's exactly what the rest of the book of Acts is all about, how the kingdom begins to grow. But Jesus reminds them that they're going to be witnesses, which means the gospel, the sowing of the seed will start in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the world as they continue to go and carry the gospel with them. So if that's the case, if there's any merit to what I'm saying, then can we see that pattern unfolding somewhat in the Gospel of Matthew, the 13th chapter, where these parables will continue? We'll see. So now beginning in the actual subject of the text that we read at the beginning of this lesson, we have in verses 34 and 35, Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables. He did not tell them anything without a parable, so that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. Interestingly enough, as what is referred to here as a prophet speaking these words, it actually comes directly from the Psalter. And so the prophet writing this is actually a psalmist, a poet, a song composer, a son of Asaph of all people. And he says from the first two verses of Psalm 78, I will open my mouth in parables. I will declare things kept secret from the foundation of the world. This word here, parables, is going to be translated a little differently when we go back to actually read Psalm 78, because what Matthew is using here as his reference text is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Psalter, or of course, all of the Old Testament at various stages. But going back to the Hebrew form of the text, this is what we find in the first four verses. My people, hear my instruction, listen to the words from my mouth. I will declare wise sayings. So this is the connection between the two. Parables being wise sayings, or other translations might render this dark sayings, meaning shrouded in mystery, enigmas, which will be verified by the next line that says, I will speak mysteries from the past. But in reality, what goes on in the rest of this psalm is not really a mystery. All he's going to do is just recount for us the history of his ancestors. And so one might begin to wonder what dark sayings, what enigmas shrouded in mystery, what riddles could be contained amongst the corpus of Israel's history that either they didn't know about, or certainly any reader that would come beyond the current generation of the psalmist who would hear or read these things for themselves, and the generation of Jews or even other Bible readers who would come after them when they peer back into the actual annals of Israel's history and see that indeed these things happened. But we go on. He says, we will not hide them from our children, but we will tell a future generation the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, which is exactly what the psalmist seeks to enumerate. In varying stages, he is going to enumerate the things that God has done, but he's also going to answer that with how Israel responded, the wondrous works that he has performed. So Jesus himself states why he uses parables, quoting directly from Isaiah 6, and that he is doing the same thing virtually that Isaiah did, and that people will respond in one of two ways as they did in Isaiah's day. Jesus is not saying the words here from Psalm 78. Instead, what we do have here is Matthew telling us that the words of the prophet or the psalmist might be fulfilled, and he is quoting for us from Psalm 78. So with that, he is connecting something that's very pivotal here. Now, I will say this. One thing we have to be a little bit more familiar with, that the readers of Matthew's gospel who were Jewish would have been firmly familiar with, and thankfully, our Bible translators for centuries now have been including this structure for us such that we would see it when we read through the Psalter, although I think many of us benignly wind up paying little to no attention. And with that, we wind up cutting ourselves gravely short of what the internal structure of the Psalter is really meant to convey. Matthew's gospel is divided up into 5 distinct discourses that all end with, and Jesus finished these teachings, or some sort of amalgamation of that, depending upon the translation that you might be reading. And so when we see that Jesus begins talking, and he goes on for a couple of chapters, or at least one chapter, the biggest of those sections being the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. But Jesus begins to teach, and he consumes a whole chapter, and then we end that with, and Jesus ended his teachings, or something like that, to move on to the next story, the next miracle, whatever. Then we have just seen a part of these 5 discourses laid out for us in Matthew's gospel, which is meant to mimic a structure that is already firmly embedded throughout other portions of Scripture that no doubt the Jewish readers of the Bible are intimately familiar with. That first grouping of 5 would obviously be the Torah of Moses. The second grouping of 5 would be what was structured to mimic the Torah of Moses, almost like a new Torah. There's no coincidence that there seems to be a narrative structure to the Psalter itself, even though there aren't many stories told in the Psalms, and the ones that are written, like Psalm 78, in song form or poem form, as everything in the Psalm is written in poem form. but they recount the stories of Israel's past. It's not telling a new narrative, just reviewing the history of old. But when you step back and you try to get the 35,000-foot bird's eye view of the Psalter, you recognize, as it's borne out for us in the headings of the Psalter, when we cross over into certain portions, we'll have book 1, book 2, book 3. There's a total of 5 books. And as much as the 5 books of Torah show the beginning of creation and everything is on a high note, we see the doldrums of Israel's story when they seemingly are at their lowest point, rebelling against God, in the heart of the Torah around the book of Numbers. You might think the heart of Torah is Leviticus, but the chronology of the book itself, the heart of the collective whole of the Pentateuch, the heart of it really happens in the book of Numbers. And with that, more of the most egregious rebellions against God, with rejection of the Exodus and so forth. But we have the high note ending of Deuteronomy with this new generation who is about to go into the land of Canaan and conquer, after listening to Moses recount their history from Sinai, moving forward to that very moment. The Psalter is the same way. It starts off on a high note with a compulsion per the opening psalm for everyone who will take the journey through the Psalter to recognize there are but one of two paths that anyone can take: that of wisdom or that of the scoffer, the mourner, the scoffer, the mocker, the sinner. And by virtue of that, the end will be one of two things. Either the wise one will become the tree planted by still waters, whose fruit will always be produced and whose leaves will never wither, drawing life from this effervescent stream at his side. Or he is going to become like the stick that's been that's rotted off and fallen from the tree to the ground. And of course, there's no future for that stick, as life has been completely sapped from it. And by virtue of that, it needs to be gathered up and thrown into the fire. And then the journey through the Psalter after that is looking at the history of Israel, watching how God has brought them through their ascendancy as a nation who are oppressed. And of course, in the Psalter, a lot of what we're seeing with respect to Israel's history is kind of seen in the lens of David's own personal life, as many of those words in the very first Psalms, much of the first book of the Psalms, are all David's own life experiences in the Psalms that he wrote. But with that, he's mirroring Israel's ascendancy as a nation who was born out of oppression in Egypt to a kingdom that God had forged out of, a people who had no future and no prospects for hope, but due to a promise that God had made their ancestor Abraham. And then holding true to that promise, delivers them out of oppression and slavery, and it delivers them to the very inheritance that he said he would give them, and then gives them everything necessary for them to thrive as he chooses himself to live amongst them. But what is the history that proceeds after, or I should say, that follows after that? They instead continue to rebel. And with that, we arrive here in the third book of the Psalter, where Psalm 78 is nestled, which all speak of how God has judged his people in allowing them to be carted off into exile because of their persistent rebellion against God. So that being said, why is Matthew alluding to this? Just so happens that when you consider the actual layout of the structure of Matthew's gospel, Matthew 13 actually comes around the heart of Matthew's gospel, or the center point of Matthew's gospel. And it's no coincidence that when you consider that the Masoretes, the ones I had just mentioned earlier, who were the great architects of the preservation of God's word as goes copying it and making sure that it continued on for generations to come after them, and a practice was in place to ensure that painstaking effort was made to ensure that nothing changed within the word of God, and all corrections and errors were immediately identified and accounted for and corrected in the manuscripts, or the manuscript itself destroyed and a new one to take its place, so that every single letter of every single word of every single paragraph was perfectly preserved. But the Masoretes marked the center of every book, and with that, they marked Psalm 78 as the center point of the Psalter. So the center point of Matthew's gospel and the center point of the Psalter happen to both bear out sayings from one another, that Matthew is quoting directly from the 78th Psalm to tell us his perspective as the Spirit guided him to write these words. This is the reason why Jesus spoke in parables. Now, if we continue to look deeper into Psalm 78, I think we're going to see some very important truths here. So in Psalm 78, when you look at verses 12 through 16, I'm not going to read the big chunk from Matthew 8 and 9 on the side of the screen here. Instead, I'm just going to speak in overarching generalities here. But back to Psalm 78, he worked wonders in the sight of their ancestors. He worked wonders while they were in Egypt. He split the sea, he brought them across, and he split the water like a wall. And he led them through a cloud by day, fire by night. He split rocks in the wilderness, and he gave them to drink. And he brought streams out of the stone and made water flow like rivers. So great wonders, both while they were in Egypt and while they were in the wilderness, to first deliver them and then to preserve them. In Matthew 8 through 9, what we see are several blocks of miracles that Jesus performs, all smashed together. We have the like of Jesus immediately after the Sermon on the Mount ends, cleansing a leper. Then he goes to Simon Peter's house and he cures his mother-in-law from a fever. And then after that, we see Jesus and his disciples sailing on the open seas while Jesus was asleep. And then the great storm comes. Jesus rebukes the sea and the wind, and there's a great calm. Then they make their way across the sea. They face the Gadarene demoniacs. Jesus casts those demons out into a herd of pigs. And then after that, as he comes back across the lake, he's back in the region of Capernaum, and there happens to be a paralytic man brought to him by his friends. He forgives his sins, and then he tells the paralytic man to take up his stretcher and go home. Then, sometime later in that particular story, we have Jesus being summoned to the house of Jairus, where his 12-year-old daughter is sick, nigh unto death. She dies while Jesus is en route, and of course, he's held up by the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, coming to Jesus to just touch the robe of his, or the hem of his garment, so that she could be made whole, right? And then, of course, Jesus continues on in his journey to heal the dead girl. And then, of course, we have Jesus being approached by men who are blind, and they seek Jesus's healing touch to deliver their eyesight back. And he says, "Let it be done for you," and their eyes are open. So all of this to say, we have wondrous miracles that Jesus is performing for them. As much as we can say, looking at Psalm 78, that God performed miracles for his people through preserving them in Egypt and out in the wilderness to show himself to them so that they would understand his nature, which he, of course, further expounds upon in Exodus 34 by saying, the Lord, gracious and kind, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, even to 1,000 generations of those who love him. Now, we move further down in Psalm 78, and what is the response of the people of Israel after God had done these wonderful things? They continue to sin, they rebel in the desert, they deliberately test God, demanding food that they crave, and they even wonder to themselves, is God able to provide food in the wilderness after all that he had done and after all he had showed himself? So yeah, we recognize he struck the rock, water gushed out, torrents overflowed, but can he provide bread or furnish meat for his people? As if to say, that's not enough. In spite of all that God had done through 10 plagues in Egypt and what he had done so far in the wilderness, as he has preserved them not once, but multiple times through providing water for a vast amount of people that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, including their livestock, to flourish with, water being the more important thing than just bread to sustain them with. And yet they want bread, and they don't think that God is capable unless he proves himself. So we go back to Matthew 12, which of course is not really part of our lesson integrally, but instrumentally it certainly is when we appreciate what this tells us. Because we have a demon-possessed man who was blind, unable to speak, brought to Jesus. Jesus heals him. But how do the crowds respond? Some will say, could this be the son of David? There should be enough evidence in what they've seen and heard, both in this particular miracle and everything else that Jesus has done, that some of these people no doubt saw as well. And of course, they have heard about as news spread rapidly and wildly about what Jesus was doing. When the Pharisees hear this, this is how they respond. The leaders of the community in Jesus's day responding as those did in Moses's day. This man drives out demons by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons. They test Jesus. So then we go further on in Psalm 78. So God rained manna down from heaven for them. So that's part of the enigma that the psalmist is speaking of. is that while they are testing God, God would have had every right to, in that moment, destroy them, to spurn them. He owed them nothing. After they had tested his character like this, understanding that what is said, as goes the penalty for such a thing, both in the law and even by Jesus himself, saying that such things are not allowed to be spoken about the Holy Spirit with respect to questioning his character or judgment. That being said, God graciously acquiesces to his people. He chooses not to consign or condemn them to death, though he will bring quail by driving through an east wind a vast swarm or many flocks of them into the geographic area where these people are settled in for the moment, and allows them to eat while the food is in their mouths. Plague breaks out amongst the people. Thousands will die, but he doesn't annihilate the whole community. He, of course, teaches them a lesson through this. But first, before he does that, he rains down bread from heaven. And the people even eat what is referred to by the psalmist as the bread of angels. And of course, he winds up bringing winged birds, quail for them, so that everyone around gets the chance to eat the meat that they were craving. And they were, notice, completely satisfied because he gave them what they craved. In Matthew 14, what do we have but the very story of Jesus having taught and even healed amongst a vast throng of people who were following him until now, 3 days into the journey. He says, they've been with me this long. I have compassion on them. We need to feed them. Jesus has no intent of turning them away. He wants to feed them here and now. And of course, he does so through the 5 loaves, the 2 fishes, and everyone eats until they were completely satisfied. So we have some very keen clues here that are showing us the intimate structuring between Matthew's gospel and the 78th Psalm. But it continues on. In spite of what God had done there in the wilderness for them through bread and quail, they continue to rebel and they test the Most High God. They do this by not keeping his decrees. They treacherously turn away like their ancestors. They become warped like a faulty bow, and they enraged him with their high places, provoked his jealousy with their carved images. So what does God do? He abandons the tabernacle at Shiloh, the very house that he had intended through his design of it to meet with these people as a new Garden of Eden, for him to stroll with them through their anointed and exalted representative of the high priest, the son of Aaron. But everyone would get a chance to at least come close and offer offerings and ascend, as it were, to the very courts of the Most High by offering those burnt offerings and the ashes and smoke of that animal as it rises up to the Most High. And as the smoke and the incense and the smell of the sacrifice on the altar of burnt offering fill the nostrils of the Most High, and he is pleased to accept that offering, he is inviting the worshiper into his presence, as we talked about before. But he allows this very house of meeting to be destroyed because of their contention with him and consistently abandoning their covenant arrangement with him, and again seeking to burn their lust out on worshiping false images or carved images, as it were, false idols, and by virtue of that committing spiritual adultery. What does Jesus wind up saying here to the leaders of the community, as the psalmist is here recounting how the community leaders responded in Moses' day? He speaks to the Pharisees and says, "You snakes, brood of vipers, how can you escape being condemned to hell? I sent you prophets, sages, scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some you will flog in your own synagogues and persecute from town to town. Because of this, all the righteous blood from Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar, all of these things will come on this generation." And and then of course this bleeds over into the beginning of Matthew 24, where Jesus is going to start what we call the Olivet Discourse. And as Jesus left the temple, his disciples call his attention to the buildings, and he says, "Do you see these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left on another that will not be thrown down." As much as God allowed the abandonment of the tabernacle and its destruction at Shiloh to occur in the days of Samuel and so on, so Jesus was saying the very thing that happened then, and of course was repeated at the hands of the Babylonians, will occur one final time at the hands of the Romans in their generation. They would see these things with their own eyes. And of course, all of this would come because, as those in Moses' day rebelled and tested, so the same thing is happening here, as Jesus is saying, these leaders, instead of seeing and acquiescing to the truth, are acting deceptively like the snake in the garden, as a brood of vipers were, continuing on in their rebellion against God, poisoning the community with their venom as they continue to seethe against Jesus, their own wicked desire to overthrow him and to crucify him so that they can maintain their place of power and privilege over the people, thinking they are serving God rather than rebelling against him. So here is the last little bit of reference I'll make, and then I'll go back to the parables, because I'm sure you're wondering, hey, this is okay. I can see where you're going with this, but I really don't understand what this has to do with the parables. We're almost there. So Psalm 78, verses 65 through 72. So what does the Lord do? At the end of this long discourse where the psalmist is drawing out Israel's history and speaking about what God had done, how he continued to exercise mercy to these people, even though there's the moment of judgment at Shiloh, or other moments such as the quail, and what God did there. Yet he continued to act benevolently to his people. And while they continue on in their rebellion, that eventually ends up in their being cast out of the land and sent off in exile, which we should understand the 78th Psalm, written by a son of Asaph, is most likely written during the time of the exile, as a descendant of Asaph had been taken off into exile, and we understand his sons were also part of the first wave of exiles who return in preparation for the rebuilding of the temple and the reestablishment of their order of choir and music members that would properly lead worship in this new temple. So the Lord responds, waking up as if from sleep, like a warrior from the effects of wine, and he beat back his foes. He gave them everlasting disgrace. He rejected the tent of Joseph, meaning the northern kingdom of Israel, that was synonymous with the term Ephraim, or in some cases, Samaria. The northern kingdom was rejected, and many of those exiles did not return. Some would have had to, because if you consider the idea that in Luke's gospel, you have Anna the prophetess that's there when Joseph and Mary bring the infant Jesus into the temple to be properly dedicated. And with that, Anna, it comes to see, she is noted to be a descendant of Asher, which Asher was one of those northern tribes that was taken away by the kingdom or the empire of Assyria. So some of those people did make it back, but the vast majority of those who returned were actually the descendants of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. That being said, he chose instead the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. He rebuilt his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth that was established forever. The understanding would be the temple was built by Solomon before the split of the kingdom. By virtue of that, it would seem that the psalmist must be referring to a new temple being built, which of course would mean that this is most likely not even written during exile, but after exile. He chose David, his servant, and took him from among the sheep pens, which of course that happened historically. He is referring to the fact of the Davidic dynasty that was established with this particular historical figure he just mentioned. But he's using that through the lens of the prophets to speak to the idea that that's exactly what he intends to do after the restoration to the land. The Messiah that the prophets had promised is going to come from the tribe of David. And of course, as David had shepherded the people of Israel, descended from Jacob, in the land of his inheritance, the new Messiah from David will do the same thing, shepherding them with a pure heart and guide them with his skillful hands. Is this not what Jesus is telling us in Matthew 28 when he says, after his victorious triumph over death, that authority in heaven and on earth is now his. He rules and reigns over everything. He is that Messiah. And then, of course, the idea is this Messiah is going to shepherd and lead them. And this is exactly what Jesus winds up saying to them when he tells them to go to the furthest ends of the earth, and he will be with them as they share in his authority, bringing this kingdom with them wherever they go. So, to wrap all this up, you might be asking, okay, what does this have to do with these parables? Understanding, if what I've said remains true, if it continues to hold water, the significance would be that according to these particular parables of Jesus saying that the kingdom is like a mustard seed, then perhaps what we've seen here is that over the course of time between the exile and the restoration and then the arrival of Messiah, the mustard seed may have actually been, instead of what we are most often taught to be the way we should presume to read this parable is that Jesus was sowing the mustard seed at that time, was that according to the language of John the Baptist and Jesus himself, the time of harvest has come in their day. Now, you may wonder, well, then is there significance to the understanding of these parables for us here and now? And I'll get to that in just a second. But perhaps then the kingdom was like the lump of leaven that was placed into the lump or into the batch of dough. And of course, with the mustard seed, a tiny little seed so small that if you just barely breathe, it's going to fly off the tip of your finger, that was sown into the ground, but then over time would become a mighty tree, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because a mustard seed grows into a bush, and certainly not a tall, stately bush, but a small thing, something that would not be impressive to the eye by no means. But Jesus talks about it as if it's a tree so big that all kinds of birds from the sky can come and nest in its branches. So it will have a magnificent appearance, but not to the outward eye. It would be unassuming to anyone else. And certainly if the kingdom had been growing from the days of the exile up until the time when Jesus arrives, one might look at it and think it completely unassuming, and no one would assign to it a measure of significance. According to the words of Ezekiel that spoke about the kingdom of Israel in the days of from David all the way up until their exile at the hands of Babylon, being like a mighty stately cedar tree, and the top of it being plucked off by an eagle and carted off to a foreign land. And then speaking about a portion of that tree being brought back and planted on the mountains of Israel and to grow and flourish there again. In their mind, when the kingdom was restored unto them, it would appear like a mighty stately cedar tree again. And yet Jesus was saying the kingdom of heaven is not going to appear that way to the outward eye. To the outward eye, it's going to appear like a mustard bush. But to the spiritual eye, it will be this mighty tree that will allow all the birds from the air to nest in its branches. But it will take time to grow, as the seed itself is not like Jack's beanstalk beans that he went and threw out in the yard over in the evening, and overnight it grew up into a mighty beanstalk that reached up into the sky above him where the giant's castle was. It wasn't going to be something that would happen. And if we think about it, considering the way that John and Jesus describe the harvest of their day, and that being marched through the words of these parables that Jesus gives, it would almost make it sound as if it would be an instantaneous thing if Jesus is both sowing the initial stages of the kingdom and they're harvesting in his lifetime. Rather, it would make more sense, perhaps, if we especially go to the second parable with it being like a lump of leaven or yeast that's sown into or hidden in within the batch of dough, and then over time will eventually knead its way throughout the entire lump of dough so that it's ready to be baked and become that delicious loaf of bread that the person was waiting for. Or one might also consider these additional parables here of the kingdom of heaven being like a treasure buried in a field. The idea is that the man did not anticipate finding this. And so it's a surprise to these people that the kingdom of heaven has arrived the way that it has, considering the person who is bringing the kingdom into existence. Jesus, this unassuming carpenter who's come from Nazareth that nobody would have assumed at first look was Messiah until you hear what he says, you see what he does, you weigh the evidence for what it is, and the inescapable conclusion has to be that indeed he is the Messiah that they've waited for. And for others, some are even saying more about this man than just him being a mere human being or Messiah, for that matter. And of course, as he speaks about the kingdom and what life in this kingdom is going to be like, it's unlike anything that they thought of. It's a complete surprise to them. And one would also even understand, too, that this is a treasure that was found in the field. And most oftentimes in the Old Testament, references to the land are references to the kingdom or the actual patch of earth that Israel lived on, as goes the land of Canaan that was promised to them as a perpetual land grant that seemingly would never end. So by virtue of that, it's an earthly kingdom that they were hoping for, and that, of course, pertains to them. But then Jesus backs this up with another parable about a merchant who was unlike the man who unintentionally and surprisingly finds the treasure in the field. this merchant is actually looking for pearls. He's the guy going through the marketplaces and peeling through each one of the oysters, looking for pearls until he finds the one of great value. So he's intentionally looking for, in this case, the pearls, the kingdom. A man who was looking for the kingdom. Now, of course, oysters and these pearls being pulled from the sea, and oftentimes in the Old Testament, sea being a reference to the nations who surround Israel, and in the chaos of the sea are ready to implode and, of course, swallow up tiny little Israel, as long as if God allows them to do that, which, of course, in the cycles of judgment they experience, he does. That being said, that if the pearl of great price is taken from the sea, and in both cases, the man who wants to possess the field that he's buried the treasure in and have it to himself, or the merchant who sells everything he has to possess this pearl, both Jew and Gentile will give up everything for the sake of possessing the kingdom and giving all of their loyalty and allegiance to it, as they have let go, renouncing all the rest of their possessions and giving their full total commitment to the possession of this one thing. Now, you might draw a bone of contention with this and say, yes, but what about the last sentence where Jesus says, when he's finishing up the pearl of great price, and then moves on to another parable where he speaks about a great dragnet being dragged through the sea, hauling up a lot of fish, and then as the fish are all sorted out, as they would be with every catch, the dead are tossed aside because they can't be sold, or they're the worthless ones, and then the good fish are tossed into containers to be sold at the marketplace. So at the end of the age, as if to say this is the judgment yet to come at the end of our age, the angels are going to go out, separate the evil from the righteous, and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But is this not what John said? John said the harvest that would arrive with the kingdom would be like this, and the arrival of the kingdom, as it's been planted for some time before, is now beginning in its stages of ripening, as goes the harvest time. And of course, with that, John said there would be an ingathering of the wheat and a destruction of the chaff. Daniel uses these very words in Daniel 12 when he speaks to the idea of there being a resurrection. And of course, the righteous will arise to everlasting life. And of course, the wicked will arise to everlasting damnation. Now, do we not see this in Matthew's gospel, though? I mean, the funny thing is that Matthew is the only one who records, number one, these parables, and number two, he actually speaks to a resurrection that happened at the time when Jesus was resurrected from the dead, such that the patriarchs of the Old Testament period were seen wandering through the streets of Jerusalem, and yet none of the other gospel writers make the effort to mention this outside of Matthew. Some have even relegated this to some legendary or mythical side of Matthew's gospel, and perhaps it doesn't necessarily need to be seen as truthful, even though it's nestled right alongside the tale or account of Jesus's own resurrection. But of course, if we are assuming and trusting that that was true, that in and of itself was a resurrection. And with that, there had to have been a settling out of the righteous who were then being delivered up into everlasting life, while we can assume, though it's not mentioned, that the wicked were awakening to everlasting damnation. I'm giving you things to think about. I don't want you to think at the end of all of this that you are hearing what I'm saying as dogmatic truth. It has to be seen this way. Happens to be one of those lessons where at the end, I myself am a little uncomfortable leaving you like this, wondering, well, how should I understand it? Which way should I go with believing? I present the information and I want you to pray over it, and I'm asking that you take it seriously and question what you've heard before and whether or not what I'm saying perhaps makes better sense of it. Not because I'm saying it, certainly this did not come from my mind. I've studied behind far brighter minds than mine, and this is the conclusion that they have arrived at. And I too share in the sentiment of thinking this makes better sense of what Jesus is saying, that ultimately the harvest phase of these parables has come in his day. And the timeless truth of that would be this would be continually repeated throughout the age of church history that we are still in now. And so there is a timeless application that we can extrapolate from this. And ultimately, that is, the kingdom continues to grow. And there will be one final harvest at the end. But it's important for us to appreciate where these parables lie within Matthew's gospel and its relation to Psalm 78 and what this ultimately means with respect to the end of that psalm. And then Jesus' proclamation of himself being the new Davidic Messiah who rules over heaven and earth, possessing all authority, sharing in that authority with his disciples, sending us as he shepherds us to make disciples of the nations and continue the ingathering process. I hope this has been informative and a blessing to your soul. Lord Jesus, I pray that you would continue to make this clear as only you can. Lord, all of this for your glory's sake and for the edification of our faith and discipleship and walking and following with you and following you. In your name we pray. Amen.